Do you feel, Charles, as if this was an intentional attempt by the police to quash political speech, or do you think that they were just following the Patriot Act to the letter, and that they actually did intend to try to control terrorism by sweeping the street of all people?
Well, I think that the New York City Police Department were just doing their job. And I know that that's kind of a, they say, well, the Nazis are just following orders and all this stuff. I don't want to take it that far. I'm really willing to bet that the bulk of the New York City Police Department were just doing what they thought they had to do. I'm utterly convinced that the orders came down from up above. I think it was all Homeland Security and Secret Service and the Republican National Committee that was handing out the orders. And I think that when you start to deal with people on a person-to-person basis, you're dealing with a beat cop who's got a family and who watched 9/11 happen right in front of his face, you start to connect on a very human level. And they don't want to go for this stuff any more than we want to go for it. But when you're dealing with the powers that be in Washington and the larger powers of the FBI and Homeland Security, which have been monitoring activists and infiltrating, nonviolent peace groups and harassing people and preemptively locking them up before they even got to the convention, that's when you start to deal with something a lot more sinister.
I have a question, actually, and I have an opinion too, but quickly, because I don't think we have much time, I just wanted to say that, to me, I always look at demonstrations and protests as a goal to something else. It's not a goal per se, right? And somebody who has worked as propagandist and a spin doctor partially, I have to ask you, Charles, and you, Mike, what do you think this accomplished? I think it was a failure, the protest. Okay. Why? And I think because, first of all, George W. Bush, the idiot, I can say that, I can't vote, has 10% boost after the RNC. You got arrested, the law was broken. Mm-hmm. I don't see any inquiry into that. I don't see masses suddenly waking up to the fact that the country is not as well off as it used to be. So what did the protest accomplish?
Well, it's possible that
that's a good point. And, if I may, mm-hmm. I think I agree with you in that techniques of protest that had been used for previous generations are proving their obsolescence now. I think that's fairly clear. But on the other hand, I think that the fact that there are 2,000 people arrested in a day, that there are people willing to go to the lengths that some of us who actually, Mike's in a very different position than I was. Mike was a legitimate victim. He was somebody that was just trying to stand there and record the incident or witness it, but he wasn't a participant. I was somebody who actually consciously participated in a die-in. And I attribute most of what you're saying to the absolute irresponsibility and lack of coverage on part of the mainstream media. If you harken back to 1968, what turned the tide in 68 was that Daley decided to sic his police force on the hippies. And when he did so, the police indiscriminately cracked skulls towards anyone they could find. They made the big mistake of attacking the press. And the next day, in all the major papers, in all the syndicated news wires, was Daley attacks press, Daley attacks people indiscriminately. And once the mainstream media turned against the establishment, which was represented by Daley, when he said, this is Chicago, this is America, and they said, oh, well, if this is America, then what are you doing, beating up our kids? And here was a number of teenage and young, children in their 20s calling their parents saying the Chicago police have attacked us, and then all of this makes it into the papers the next day, and then Walter Cronkite talks about it on the news the next day. That swung the tide. What we have today is a media that is completely an arm and an extension of the political apparatus.
Well, let me ask you, you and Mike both now, or all of you, is protest now particularly a liberal form of speech? Is you know, if you march in a parade and chant, is that basically a liberal tactic to conservatives?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, some of the most violent and some of the most energetic protests are the pro-lifers on the very conservative side. When I was in Boston for the Democratic National Convention, there was a contingent of pro-lifers that were driving around huge vans that had these 6-foot-high photocopies of mutilated fetuses from abortions on them.
I saw those too.
Huge contingencies of people that were following behind them, condemning the Democrats for being, decadent and for killing unborn human beings.
So, Charles,
I would definitely say it's not a liberal thing.
I'm wondering if
the protest is protest. It's an extension of democracy. But what's happening now is that the protest itself, particularly the liberal end of the protest, is being marginalized. It's being mocked. It's being belittled.
Have you, Charles, have you ever seen instances of right-wing protests being dealt with in the same way that the liberal protests are being dealt with, particularly in New York?
Say that again?
Well, the instances of the pro-life movement and other conservative protests. Do you see police crackdown on those groups the way you saw with the liberal protesters in New York?
You saw a lot more of it in the 90s when the pro-life movement got violent and started bombing clinics.
Yes.
And there was quite a bit of police reprisal against that. And there was quite a bit of the security establishment rolled out to protect abortion doctors and clinic workers and so on and so forth.
Understandably.
So yeah, I think it is relevant and it is relative. And I think it is reflected by who's ever in power. So what we have now is a very conservative establishment, and so what they're going to do is demonize the liberal or progressive element. If you have the other element in power, they're going to demonize the other side. Ultimately, what it all boils down to is that we live in a country that is completely divided in half, and half the country does not want to hear what the other half has to say. But until we start listening to each other, until we start sitting down and talking to each other as people, respectfully, peacefully, then we're not going to get anywhere, and we're certainly not going to solve any of this, and we're certainly not going to recognize that it's all of us against the power establishment, and that they're only creating this arbitrary division between us. We're all working people. We're all poor. We're all trying to just get by. And these folks up here, whether they're John Kerry or whether they're George Bush, they're all trying to pull something on an entirely different level than what we, as normal Americans, are accustomed to.